Welcome to episode 8 of our series on business cycles. We move from the Industrial Revolution into the Golden Age of expansion. The second Kondratieff, Part 2, covering the years 1843 to 1913. Now, if you've joined us before, you know we're not just here to read historical summaries. We're on a mission. We're trying to understand the profound underlying mechanics that really drive global capitalism, those great waves of structural transformation. In our deep dive today, it takes us right into the long 19th century. We're going to examine how this massive, 70-year expansion was not some smooth, continuous rise.
Not at all.
Instead, it was this incredibly complex process, constantly complicated, accelerated, and in many ways defined by the shorter, sharper operational rhythms of the business cycles running right underneath the surface.
The juggler and the kitchen waves.
Exactly, the 7 to 11-year juggler and the little 3 to 5-year kitchen waves. So we're confirming how the interplay of all these forces really dictated the tempo of the entire era.
And to set the stage for this immense period, 1843 all the way to 1913, we really have to identify its defining structural engine. So while the first Kondratieff, K1, that was all about steam power, textiles, the second Kondratieff, or K2, is the era of, well, the word is ferroviarization.
Ferroviarization, so railroad construction.
The worldwide construction of the railroad network. And this wasn't just, a technological improvement.
No.
It was an investment tsunami. It fundamentally reshaped geography, capital formation, governance, everything. It was the deep structural change that enabled true global capitalism. It turned these vast expanses of the American Midwest and the West into productive economic centers almost overnight.
Right.
And, without this initial massive capital deployment, the innovations that came later in the K3 phase, they just never could have taken root.
So let's lock in those 70 years then, 1843 to 1913. Why 1843? It seems like a bit of an arbitrary date right in the middle of the century.
It does, and there's some debate. Some historians try to pull the early 1840s back into the final, liquidation phase of K1.
The cleanup from the last cycle.
Exactly. But the shift that happens after 1842 is it's undeniable. And it's systemic. This wasn't a slow crawl out of recession. This was the emergence of systemic, large-scale innovation capital beginning to flow and flow aggressively.
So you can actually see it in the data.
Oh, you see it everywhere. The liquidation of the old period's excesses had cleared the financial system, and then suddenly, all the key indicators just surge.
Like what?
We're talking land sales, the foundational asset rising dramatically, massive increases in bank deposits, stock prices climbing consistently, and commodity prices beginning that long upward surge.
The decks had been cleared.
The decks had been cleared, and the capital required for this massive railroad build-out was finally ready to mobilize.
And by fitting this era into the long wave model, we get a critical advantage, right? We can understand that the periods of distress weren't just random misfortunes.
Precisely. They were necessary. They were inevitable phases of adaptation. So we break K2 into 4 distinct phases, each lasting roughly, say, 14 to 20 years.
Okay, so what's the first one?
The initial prosperity phase, that runs from about 1843 up to the long wave upper turning point, which is around 1857.
And this is the big build-up.
This is the rapid build-out phase. It's characterized by intense speculative excitement, easy credit, and a global demand for iron, and then later, steel, to lay all those tracks. Investment just flows rapidly into these new leading sectors, and it creates these significant but also potentially very unstable financial systems.
And once that initial easy stage of expansion is saturated, I assume the system hits its first major inflection point, that upper turning point around 1857.
That's it. And then it transitions into the recession downswing phase.
Okay.
And that lasts roughly from 1857 to 1870. Now, this period is complex because, it includes the chaos of the American Civil War.
Right, a huge external factor.
A huge one. But structurally, it's marked by the painful adjustments required to absorb the vast new capacity created by that first wave of railroad construction. Prices stabilize, competition heats up, financial systems start to consolidate.
Then comes the long slog. The Depression phase, running approximately from 1870 to 1897.
And this phase is critical because it's often mislabeled in history as the Great Depression of the late 19th century.
Right. People hear Great Depression and they immediately think 1929.
Exactly. But this wasn't defined by stagnation in production. In fact, production actually soared.
So what defined it?
Persistently low prices, deflation. and savage structural competition. This deflation was the necessary consequence of radical technological efficiency, forcing prices down across every single sector. So you have this 27-year period that sees an array of deep juggler cycles trying and really failing to achieve sustained high prosperity against this relentless downward long-term price trend.
So if the Depression is defined by structural deflation and competitive liquidation, the shift around 1897 must be equally structural. What exactly defines the transition into the recovery phase, starting around 97 or 98?
The shift is remarkable because the statistical series just break dramatically. It's not just one index, it's aggregate indicators. Wholesale prices, interest rates, capital formation, they all turn upward decisively and persistently.
It's a clear signal.
A very clear signal. The recovery phase quickly transitions into the upswing of the third Kondratieff, K3. The break at 1897 signals that the liquidation of the old railroad overcapacity is complete, and these entirely new innovation clusters.
Electricity, chemistry.
Exactly. Electricity, chemistry, mass production. They've achieved the critical mass needed to dictate the global economic trend. The system has fully assimilated the K2 revolution and is now being pulled forward by K3.
Let's unpack the railroad's role then. Because if we're looking for the evolutionary model of economic cycles, the railroad seems to be the clearest example of a leading innovation cluster.
It's the textbook case.
It fits the criteria perfectly.
Yep.
It required massive capital, had an extremely long gestation period. I mean, you can't build a national network in 2 years.
Not at all.
It fundamentally dislocated existing industries. And critically, it created this entire ecosystem of innovation in secondary industries, from iron and steel to coal and telegraphy.
And the physical and financial scale. That's what separates it from earlier innovations like the cotton gin or the textile mill. It's just staggering to read that in the U.S., the Midwest and the West were economically created by this network.
Created, not just improved.
Created. Before the rail, these lands were too remote or too expensive to access for profitable, large-scale agriculture. The railroad solved that by radically reducing transport costs and allowing the development of entirely new resource bases.
Do we have any numbers to put that in perspective?
Well, consider this in the context of the time. By 1860, the U.S. already operated about 30,000 miles of track. But the financial commitment is what really matters for the cycle.
The debt.
The capital debt associated with this initial construction reached approximately $900 million. In 1860, that $900 million was an astronomical sum.
Unthinkable.
It required the mobilization of international capital, speculative land grants, state and federal aid. It literally forced the institutional changes we talked about simply because the old system couldn't handle that level of financing.
And when you look at the total U.S. federal debt in the early 1860s, before the immense spending of the Civil War, this private commercial debt load, it approaches or even exceeds the national debt at times.
It does.
And that just demonstrates the incredible confidence, or maybe more accurately, the speculative fever that accompanied this engine.
It does. And we have to distinguish between the types of innovation here.
How so?
Well, if a small regional entrepreneur runs a new line that's 50 miles long, that's a local innovation. It's important, but it's local.
Okay.
But when you look at the system-wide interconnected national network, what we call the ferroviarization, that constitutes an innovation of a higher order.
I see. The network effect.
Exactly. It changes the marginal cost of everything. It standardizes gauges, introduces systematic scheduling, and allows massive economies of scale in everything from farming to manufacturing. That systemic innovation is powerful enough to drive the 70-year Kondratieff wave.
And that explains why the impact was so revolutionary, generating these multiple simultaneous cycles of different durations all running underneath it.
That's the one.
Let's talk about the culture that enabled this. The sources repeatedly identify the K2 era as the most bourgeois period of capitalist evolution. Now, this isn't just a descriptor, is it? It defines the whole psychological and political backdrop.
It really does. The commercial and industrial classes, the rising bourgeoisie, they held this unprecedented sway over politics, culture, national policy.
And that political climate was vital.
Oh, absolutely. Because it aimed to minimize external political interference with the economic process. The bourgeois ideal was that economic changes, driven by technology and competition, should just be allowed to run their course.
And that would force the necessary institutional adaptations.
Right. The result was a surprisingly clear manifestation of pure economic cycling, much less clouded by state intervention than in K1 or, well, certainly K3.
But hold on, this is where the contradiction emerges for me. If the bourgeois ideal is minimal interference, how do we square that with the fact that railroads required massive state subsidies, land grants, political favoritism just to get started?
That's the core paradox, isn't it?
It seems like they only wanted the state to stay out once the infrastructure was already in place, paid for with public help.
You've hit on the paradox of early industrial policy. They wanted limited government, except when limited government meant they couldn't acquire the sheer scale of capital needed to fund the leading innovation.
A convenient exception.
Very. But in terms of operational policy, they did maintain non-interference. For example, look at U.S. tariff policy.
Okay.
Protectionism was a huge political football. It resulted in measures like the McKinley Tariff of 1890, and yet the sources compellingly argue that external tariffs never substantially influenced the cyclical turning points.
So all that political drama was just noise.
In a way. Because the truly profound economic policy was internal free trade. The elimination of internal barriers and the creation of that massive Midwestern market by the railroads. That was exponentially more impactful than the fluctuating external duties on specific imports.
So the structural engine was just too powerful.
Exactly. The political drama over tariffs, while it was important for regional interests, the sources call it curiously unreal when you view it against the sheer scale of the internal commerce the railroads created. The K2 engine was powerful enough to absorb and largely neutralize the disruptive potential of these short-term political squabbles.
And this era also saw the maturation of the financial institutions you need for a global economy.
Right.
The most important change cited was the creation of the national banking system, especially after the Civil War.
Right.
But even before that, we saw the emergence of systems that acted like quasi-central banking, especially as New York established itself as the financial hub, providing liquidity and clearing functions for the whole country.
And you also saw voluntary reforms like the safety fund systems pioneered in Massachusetts and New York. That shows the private sector trying to stabilize itself.
And this maturity was rooted in a foundational belief about fiscal policy, right? The doctrine of, what was it?
Parsimony and economy. Public spending was deeply, deeply distrusted. Taxation was seen as a necessary evil to be confined only to the amounts and methods that interfered minimally with private income disposition.
The whole era was predicated on the sanctity of private accumulation.
Absolutely. Which brings us back to that incredible anecdote from the sources about the Prussian tax reformer, Michel. It just crystallizes the mindset of the K2 era perfectly.
I love this story.
It's amazing. Michel, an incredibly influential figure, allegedly believed that an income tax rate approaching 5% at the highest bracket was dangerously high.
5%.
5%. He thought it could undermine the long-term saving habits of the nation. I mean, when we look at modern tax structures, that perspective is almost unbelievable, isn't it?
It's hard to even comprehend.
But it demonstrates the absolute priority placed on private capital accumulation, sound currency, the gold standard, and the belief that the state's budget must minimally intrude on this process.
It was a long-term, savings-focused mindset.
A mindset necessary to fund the immense, capital-intensive K2 innovations. If capital accumulation was considered the greatest public virtue, then the state had no right to confiscate more than an absolute minimum necessary for defense and public order.
So we have the gold standard, standardized banking, large corporations, and a fiscally conservative state. How did this institutional maturity change the way crises actually manifested, compared to, say, the volatile early crashes of K1?
The crises were different in character. K1 crises, while they were destructive, they often involved the collapse of relatively simpler regional industries and financial bubbles.
Right.
K2 crises, however, involved incredibly deep structural changes. We're talking about the permanent shift of agricultural production from Europe to North America, the forced obsolescence of old ironworks by new steel technologies, really fundamental stuff.
So the institutions of K2, the gold standard providing an anchor, standardized debt markets.
Right.
That meant that financial panics were often sharper and shorter.
Yes, due to rapid liquidation. And if they happened during the long wave upswing, like the crisis of 1857, the recovery was relatively robust because the long-term trend was still strong. But when a short Juglar crisis coincided with the deep structural Kondratieff downswing, the resulting depression, like 1873, was excruciatingly prolonged and severe.
Why is that?
Because the short cycle was forced to adapt to a structural decreasing trend. The stability of the institutions made the financial crises acute, but the structural depth of the innovations made the subsequent depressions chronic.
Okay, so now we can map the operational rhythm. The K2 upswing, 1843 to 1870, wasn't a steady incline. It was punctuated by three distinct Juglar cycles, showing how these shorter waves dictate the real-world pace of business.
That's right.
So Juglar 1, that's 1843 to 1851. It started strong, prosperity running until mid-1845. Then came the recession and depression, 47-48. But crucially, the source materials highlight that the setbacks in late 1847 were actually muted compared to earlier crises. Why was that?
Because the preceding period of stagnation, the tail end of K1, had already forced extensive liquidation. The system was, for lack of a better word, clean.
So it could bounce back faster.
Exactly. It bounced back quickly, helped along by some external stimuli like good harvests, the move towards free trade in Britain, and, of course, the initial discovery of gold.
And the energy really ramps up in Juglar, too, from 1852 to 1860.
It certainly does. Prosperity peaks around 1856, and this cycle is critical from an evolutionary perspective because it represents the first major geographical shift in the Kondratieff process.
The geographical shift, yeah.
Railroad construction dramatically moves away from the established eastern states, and it starts pushing into the central Atlantic regions and, crucially, into the Midwest.
So this wasn't just a random fluctuation.
Not at all. It was the essential, geographically expansive realization of the core K2 innovation. It demanded new financing mechanisms and brought all these new speculative players into the game.
And this rapid expansion was, well, it was turbocharged by external factors. We often forget the immense monetary shock delivered by the gold rushes.
A huge shock.
The California discoveries from 1850 and then those in Australia, they acted as massive injections of liquidity into the global financial system.
That new gold was pure fuel for speculation. It increased the global money supply, it provided a temporary upward pressure on prices, and it dramatically lowered the real cost of debt service.
So it just made it easier to borrow for these huge projects.
It fueled the credit expansion that bankers and speculators required to underwrite the aggressive and often reckless railroad expansion into untested territories. The gold discoveries didn't cause the Juglar upswing.
But they poured gasoline on the fire.
They poured gasoline on the fire. They absolutely intensified the speculative excesses, which ensured that the eventual crash would be spectacular. The ease with which financiers could raise money globally for these risky Western ventures was unprecedented, and it masked the underlying structural issues.
And spectacular it was. The crisis of 1857 is the perfect convergence of the financial cycle and the structural long wave.
It coincided precisely with the upper turning point of the K2 Kondratieff cycle.
So what was the fundamental cause? The sources say it was the exhaustion of the immediate profitable possibilities of that first great railroad construction wave. The system had just built beyond its immediate needs.
That's the core of it. Now, on the surface, the panic was triggered by a singular financial event, the failure of the Ohio Life and Trust Company in August 1857. They were deeply exposed to railroad finance.
And that started a cascade.
A rapid one. It led to the failure of 150 banks by mid-October. Public attention fixated, and quite rightly, on banking recklessness and speculative bonds.
But the structural explanation is deeper, isn't it? It involves the Hayek effect, which describes how artificial stimuli can distort the capital structure. How did things like land grants and easy credit create this specific structural problem in 1857?
Well, the artificial stimuli, they distorted the capital structure by decoupling investment decisions from immediate consumer demand. They encouraged construction and production to be extended beyond what the economic organism could bear at the moment.
So building too far, too fast.
Precisely. The government land grants, for instance, were a form of subsidy that reduced the effective cost of construction and gave financiers highly leveraged collateral. This encouraged what we call malinvestment. Capital was drawn into projects like rail lines into unpopulated areas that could only pay for themselves over decades, yet they were financed with short-term speculative credit fueled by those gold inflows.
A huge mismatch in timelines.
A massive one. And when the financial system finally realized the discrepancy between the immediate insufficient earnings of these new lines and the immense short-term debt load, the panic ensued. The gold rush provided the credit, but the underlying structural overextension, the K-wave turning point, provided the context for the financial correction.
So the liquidation was necessary.
It was necessary to bring the capital structure back into alignment with sustainable long-term savings and real demand.
Then the third Juglar cycle is completely dominated by this massive external perturbation of the Civil War from 1861 to 1869.
Completely.
The war created an immediate financial shock, but then it rapidly transformed into a classic war boom, driven by immense government demand and, crucially, the printing of paper money, the greenbacks.
And the greenback system is a crucial monetary legacy of this period. While it led to inflation and financial disorder during the war, it also provided immense liquidity.
But what's often overlooked is the post-war phase.
Yes. The subsequent upswing was driven by renewed, non-war-related railroad construction, which continued the underlying Kondratieff process. This just shows how powerful that underlying K2 engine remained. The system quickly separated the cyclical demands of the war from the long-term evolutionary investment demands of the K2 wave.
But the monetary policy that followed is, to me, the real economic miracle here. The U.S. government allowed the paper money system to persist, and despite pressure from deflationists, they largely avoided a massive forced contraction.
You did.
Yet prices still fell dramatically at an average rate of 4% annually from 1866 all the way to 1880.
And that 4% deflation rate is just astonishing. Normally that suggests stagnation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yet at the same time, production increased 50% per capita over that same period.
Right.
And that's while absorbing a massive wave of post-war immigration.
It's incredible.
This is the ultimate evidence supporting the evolutionary model. Economic growth and genuine prosperity are possible under declining prices, provided the price decline is driven by objective, structural increases in efficiency and technological innovation.
Like cheaper steel and transport costs.
Exactly. Rather than simply a collapse in demand or a monetary contraction. The efficiency gains from the completed K2 infrastructure simply outpace the money supply, leading to what you could call evolutionary deflationary growth.
So the policy decision was key.
The strategic decision by policymakers to allow the economy to grow within its monetary jacket and to accommodate that deflationary pressure rather than forcing a drastic monetary contraction was vital. But that high liquidity environment also encouraged some lax lending habits, which definitely contributed to the severity of the subsequent crisis in 1873.
And so we now enter the K2 depression phase starting around 1870.
This is where the long-wave structural trend really dictates the outcome of the shorter cycles, and it results in prolonged liquidation and intense competition. The fourth Juglar cycle, from 1870 to 1879, took place entirely within this Kondratieff downswing.
So if the K-wave is structurally pushing down, how did we still manage to have a massive railroad boom leading up to 1873? It sounds counterintuitive to have a boom during a depression phase.
It does, but it's because it was a downhill development.
A downhill development.
It wasn't a new innovation cluster emerging. It was the realization and the completion of what had already been started and often overextended during the K2 upswing.
I see. Finishing what was already on the books.
Exactly. Construction peaked at an unprecedented level in 1871. However, the financing was managed with what the sources call carelessness.
That sounds ominous.
It was. Massive European capital, around $2 billion, was invested between 1867 and 1873, and it was leveraged through speculative credit and poorly secured bonds. It set the system up for a catastrophic secondary wave collapse. The completion of these major projects was necessary, but the speculative bubble built around their financing was just not sustainable in the face of that long-term structural deceleration.
And then the inevitable happened. The crisis of 1873 wasn't just a panic. It was, as the source material describes it, an abnormal liquidation of positions across the entire economy.
It was rooted in the exhaustion of that speculative phase of railway overextension.
It started with a financial shock in Vienna, but it was the dramatic collapse of the U.S. financial system. I'm thinking of the failure of J. Cook and Company in September 1873.
The primary financier of the Northern Pacific Railroad.
Right. That's what brought the crisis home and exposed the immense overextension in Western rail development.
And the severity of the depression that followed from 1873 to 1877 is often minimized today. But contemporary reports, they paint a picture of near total pessimism.
Can we put it in context?
Well, while hard unemployment data is unreliable, some authors cited up to 3 million vagabonds, unemployed industrial workers, in the winter of 1873-1874.
3 million.
Given the relatively smaller size of the industrial labor force compared to the population back then, the relative shock and suffering might have indeed been worse than even the height of the 1930s crisis.
That is just a sobering thought.
The social friction this caused, leading to massive strikes, increased urban poverty, political unrest, it was immense.
So when we talk about structural adaptation and liquidation, we are talking about immense, widespread human suffering. This wasn't a quick market correction. It was a societal ordeal forced by the K-wave turning downwards.
It was. It required painful price adjustment and mass unemployment to eliminate the excesses. And the explanation is clear within our framework. The extreme severity and duration weren't just bad luck, they were a systemic requirement.
Because the short Juglar cycle was forced to adapt to a structural decreasing level.
A decreasing level dictated by the long Kondratieff depression wave. The system had to force down prices, restructure massive debt, and eliminate inefficient producers across the board to assimilate the capacity built by the railroad revolution.
And the ultimate affirmation of the model
Is that the economy did recover autonomously from 1878 onwards, driven purely by the necessary structural improvements that the crisis had forced.
The K2 downswing also encompassed the painful agricultural depression, roughly 1882 to 1890 in the U.S., and this was, in a way, a perverse consequence of the success of the railroad.
The irony is rich, isn't it? The railroads, combined with new agricultural machinery, they opened up the massive, highly fertile plains.
Which sounds like a good thing.
It was for consumers, but it immediately led to global overproduction in grains, which drastically drove down prices. And that crushed less efficient and older farms, particularly those in the U.S. Northeast and all throughout Europe.
So the railroad revolution was attacking its own customers, in a way.
But in an economically constructive way, by increasing global supply.
I want to clarify the price versus income point here, because falling agricultural prices often mean disaster for farmers, but the sources make a fascinating distinction about aggregate income.
They do. They affirm that falling agricultural prices were compatible with rising total incomes for U.S. agriculture as a whole.
How is that possible?
Because the sheer volume of grain and cotton sold to Europe exploded. The American farmer was selling exponentially more, which compensated for the price drop.
So the pie got bigger, even if the price per slice was smaller.
Exactly. But the tragedy was specific. Farmers dependent on highland debt, often in older regions, saw the real burden of their fixed mortgages skyrocket as commodity prices fell. Their incomes just couldn't keep pace with their debt service.
And that created political turmoil.
It fueled major agrarian political movements seeking inflationary monetary policy, like the Free Silver movement, to alleviate their debt burdens.
We continue through this structural depression with two more Juglar cycles. Juglar 5 runs from 1879 to 1888, and it saw one more construction boom peak around 1882. But the role of the railroad had changed fundamentally.
Yes, it had. The railroad ceased to be the primary engine of new economic possibility. It became a follower of generalized economic demand.
So it was building in response to growth, not creating it.
Right. It was building in response to existing population and industrial growth, rather than leading the charge into the wilderness. And consequently, the crisis of 1884 was much less severe than 1873.
Why was that?
Partly because the worst of the K-wave structural adjustment had passed, and liquidity wasn't as violently contracted.
And this period became one of just savage internal competition within the rail sector. Freight rates were collapsing due to efficiency gains and these cutthroat price wars. I read they fell to as low as 1 cent per ton mile by 1885.
Which was ruinous for individual balance sheets, but incredibly beneficial for the entire industrial economy.
And this internal competition was the final necessary stage of liquidation.
It was. It forced normalization. It prepared the industry for the massive concentration movements that followed, leading to financial titans like Harriman and Morgan reorganizing the whole system. And it resulted in efficient, integrated management, which set the stage for the final major cleanout.
Juglar 6, from 1889 to 1897.
And the crisis it delivered in 1893 was primarily a railroad crisis, a focused, sharp financial cleansing.
How bad was it?
Approximately 1/4 of all U.S. railway capital entered receivership. This was the final massive house cleaning. It eliminated speculative debt, consolidated competing lines, and established the rationalized, monopolistic structures that would dominate finance into the 20th century.
And it marked the definitive end of the railroad as a leading innovation cluster.
Even though it remained a massive, ongoing industry, its role as the primary driver was over.
So the history of 1843-1897 definitively proves our core thesis here. The system runs on this triple wave interaction.
It really does.
The long wave defines the potential and the trend, dictated by the railroad cluster. But the operational rhythm, the actual boom, bust, and painful liquidation is dictated by the shorter juggler and kitchen cycles.
Especially their coincidence during the structural downswing. The Depression phase was essentially an ongoing war of attrition, where the shorter cycles acted as necessary liquidators of the long wave's accumulated errors.
And as K2 was finishing its painful liquidation, capital was desperately seeking new outlets, new clusters of possibility. This is the breeding ground for K3, isn't it?
It is. This is the crucial point. The depression phase of the old wave is precisely when the next wave is incubated.
Because capital is forced out of the saturated old channels, like railroads.
And into new experimental industries like chemistry and electricity.
Oil is a great example. Kerosene for lighting was a major consumer good innovation in the later K2 phase, drilled commercially starting in 1859.
Right. But the true K3 innovation wasn't the oil itself, but the organizational response it generated, the creation of Standard Oil.
The trust.
This trust centralized management and control, and it set the blueprint for the massive horizontal and vertical integration that would define modern corporate life and the next long wave. It showed how control over distribution and processing could be as vital as the product itself.
And we see these novel approaches to monetizing entrepreneurial profit emerging everywhere.
Wow.
Gas for lighting was an old K2 technology.
But natural gas, found after 1873, and its industrial applications became significant downswing developments, impacting industrial location decisions.
And even more fascinating, look at the machinery industry.
Yes. Instead of selling expensive new machinery outright, entrepreneurs found they could maximize profits by leasing the machinery.
So they're taking a royalty stream from every unit produced.
Exactly. And this system of controlling intellectual property via leasing would become foundational for the telephone and electrical industries later on.
The massive scale of K2 required massive, cheap iron. The massive scale of K3 required even cheaper, stronger steel.
Right. And while the Bessemer process had been invented earlier by W. Kelly in 1851, its successful commercial introduction was secured during the prosperity phase before 1873.
But the key innovation for the K3 future was organizational. Carnegie didn't just invent a new furnace, he invented a new corporate structure.
He really did. The vertical integration models you see in Carnegie Steel and Illinois Steel in the late 1880s and early 1890s were revolutionary. They controlled everything.
From the ore to the final product.
From the Mesabi ore ranges, the ships, the rail transport, and the final production. This preparation for massive, efficient scale was absolutely vital.
And this organizational innovation allowed the iron and steel sector to participate in that abnormal liquidation of 1893.
It did, clearing out the old, less integrated, less efficient producers.
Yeah.
It was the industry preparing itself to feed the coming explosion of skyscrapers, heavy machinery, and automobiles demanded by the K3 wave. The efficiency gains in steel production alone contributed significantly to the deflationary pressures of the K2 depression.
And the American economy, characterized by high wages and labor scarcity, really specialized in labor-saving machinery. There's no better place to see this revolution than the footwear industry, a traditional trade just blown apart by K2 innovation.
Before K2, shoemaking was entirely manual. The arrival of the Mackay sewing machine, successfully adopted around 1860, was a technological shock. It reduced the cost of sole stitching from 75 cents per pair to just 3 cents.
75 cents to 3. Can you imagine the scale of job dislocation that one machine caused? That massive, overnight drop in cost must have led to immense social friction, displaced thousands of skilled artisans who suddenly found themselves competing with a machine that cost only 3 cents per unit.
The sources confirm the intensity of the friction and the resulting social strain. It was huge, but the economic impact was undeniable and permanent.
What were the numbers on labor cost?
The net monetary labor cost dropped from $408 per 100 pairs in 1850 to a mere $35 per 100 pairs by 1900. This is how evolutionary change fundamentally alters the cost structure of an entire economy, driving the secular deflation that characterized the K2 downswing. And remember, that machinery was often leased, ensuring the entrepreneurial pioneers retained control over the profit stream generated by their innovation.
Finally, we get to the ultimate seed of K3 electricity. It had an industrial history dating back to the telegraph in the 1840s, but it was during the K2 downswing that it developed critical mass.
Telephones began commercially in 1877 with A.G. Bell, and interestingly, they adopted that same innovative leasing model used by the shoe machinery firms.
They leased the phones.
They did, but the true revolution in electric light and power began when Edison established his central stations in 1882 and 1883.
And the first truly significant quantitative achievement, proving electricity's viability, was the rapid construction of electric streetcar lines, electric traction after 1887.
That's it. This widespread infrastructure deployment, which required massive copper wiring, power generation facilities, new financial structures, it established all the necessary technical and financial bases for the coming K3 explosion.
So the traction industry was the training ground.
It was the training ground for the electrical engineers and financiers who would go on to build the modern power grid.
And crucially, the organizational seed for K3 was planted when the giants consolidated. The creation of General Electric in 1892, a merger of Edison and Thomson-Houston interests, controlled nearly all the critical patents.
And that concentration was essential. It standardized technology, it established industrial norms, and it created a single financially potent motor capable of driving the entire next long-wave revolution, much more centralized than the early, fragmented railroad era.
So with the final painful liquidation of the railroad debt crisis in 1897 complete, the economy experienced that dramatic, undeniable break of tendencies, confirming the start of the third Kondratieff or K3 upswing.
And the shift was visible across every single aggregate indicator.
And the drivers for K3 were distinctly non-railroad.
Oh yeah, electricity and the automobile. Look at the quantitative proof of the shift. Electricity production soared almost sixfold, from 3.15 billion kilowatt hours in 1899 to 19.65 billion by 1914.
A massive jump.
And this required huge investment in long-distance transmission, steam turbines, and the construction of massive hydroelectric and thermal plants, laying the foundation for the entire modern U.S. electrical system.
And even the continued addition of new rail mileage during this K3 upswing was now a secondary phenomenon, wasn't it?
Completely. It wasn't driving the economy, it was a consumptive act. It was reflecting the massive net earnings the railroads were enjoying due to the overall growth generated by steel, electricity, and the urban expansion that K3 fueled. The momentum of the long wave had definitively shifted to the new innovation cluster.
And the character of K3 prosperity was radically different from the more cautious, saving-focused K2. This era was defined by a massive wave of industrial fusions or mergers starting in 1898. This was the age of the industrial behemoth.
Symbolized, of course, by the formation of U.S. Steel in 1901, capitalized at over $1 billion.
And these fusions were themselves organizational innovations.
They were. They created new centralized control units and allowed for unprecedented management principles and technological optimization, like the construction of the massive integrated Gary plant.
And financially, they represented a new way to monetize anticipated entrepreneurial profit.
Right. Often through complex stock issuance and leveraged mergers, they focused on leveraging future scale into immediate capital concentration.
However, this new complex financial structure introduced some severe instability. The market maneuvering, particularly by rail titans like E.H. Harriman and J.P. Morgan, led to aggressive campaigns.
Like the famous Northern Pacific Corner attempt in 1901.
And the culmination of this financial adventurism was the highly disruptive financial crisis of 1907, often dubbed the Panic of the Rich.
Very good name for it.
The Panic of 1907 is crucial because, unlike the K2 crashes that were rooted in structural overbuilding, like in 1873, 1907 was primarily a financial breakdown.
That's the key distinction. It focused on the liquidity of the massive trusts and the associated banking institutions, specifically those involved in high-risk trust company lending.
So it wasn't caused by exhausted innovation possibilities or massive overproduction?
No, it was rooted in the systematic abuse of the financial apparatus, the reckless leveraging of trust shares and complex securities by financial groups. It was a crisis of confidence in the new concentrated financial power.
And it demonstrated that the organizational innovation of trustification introduced a new layer of systemic risk that the old bourgeois institutions of K2 were just unprepared to handle.
Absolutely. The failure of the Knickerbocker Trust was a purely financial event that necessitated J.P. Morgan himself to personally intervene to halt the panic. And that demonstrates the transition away from purely private economic correction toward a system that demanded concentrated quasi-state control.
If electricity reorganized industry, the automobile reorganized society. The internal combustion engine was a known technology, but its mass application was a purely entrepreneurial success that relied on reorganizing existing technology and resources.
And what's remarkable is how the early auto industry financed itself. It entirely bypassed the traditional bank lending and deposit expansion that financed the railroads.
This was financial ingenuity.
Total ingenuity. Manufacturers like Ford would purchase intermediate goods, steel, rubber, glass on credit, usually for 60 or 90 days. But they sold the final product for cash.
So they were floating their production costs on their suppliers' dime.
This massive turnover rate meant they essentially self-financed their rapid expansion by utilizing commercial credit. And it obscured the creation of the necessary credit required for innovation from the traditional banking system.
The scale-up was almost immediate. Olds Motor Works produced 4,000 units by 1903. But the world changes definitively in 1908.
The introduction of the light, cheap Ford Model T.
This introduced the concept of mass production, the moving assembly line, which was an innovation as profound as the railroad itself, slashing production time and costs.
And the numbers just tell the story of transformation. By 1914, Ford alone was responsible for nearly half of the 573,114 cars produced that year.
Yeah.
The Model T didn't just provide transportation. It created the modern consumer market, the massive petroleum industry, the highway network, and it fundamentally reshaped urban and rural life. Along with electricity, the automobile had achieved the potency required to drive the K3 upswing well into the 20th century.
And it cemented the shift from the heavy industrial expansion of K2 to the age of mass production and consumer durables. So what we've witnessed in this deep dive into the K2 era, spanning 1843 to 1913, is a sophisticated and often brutal process of structural change. The long Kondratieff wave set the ultimate structural limit, and direction railroads defined the global economy for 70 years.
Yeah.
But the real rhythm of business, the actual pain of liquidation, was delivered by the shorter Juglar cycles, especially the profound crashes of 1857, 1873, and 1893, which forced the necessary adaptations during the long wave downswing.
And the final provocative thought here is about the institutional metamorphosis of capitalism itself. We moved from the intensely bourgeois era of K2, characterized by deep faith in sound currency, minimal taxation,
Mikhail's 5% limit.
Nickel's 5% limit, and maximum private savings, into the neo-mercantilist era of K3. This new era was defined by financial prustification, immense capital concentration, and the early rise of social legislation.
So the system's own success.
Its own dynamic evolution was so powerful that it irrevocably reshaped its own institutional framework. It replaced the bourgeois ideal with a centralized, financialized system that demanded radically new drivers' electricity and mass production to continue forward.
The Great War irrevocably changed the landscape. In our next episode, Episode 9, we will analyze the brief, strange period following the war, the plateau of the 20s, 1919-1929, and the emerging signs of capitalism's decadence from Chapter 8.